coming up on Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast.
I feel like just meeting Aussie and meeting people who were into spiritual practices, people where I felt like I can just explore my sense of self and identity and not be judged for it or feel judged for it. That was actually like my catalyst. It was as if I had been just living unconsciously and not really knowing where I was going. I was just, following my intuition, but not really even knowing what that meant. Once I started on this spiritual journey, that's when I just decided, okay, rainbows everywhere. The moment people see anything online related to me, like they will know, awesome. And I don't have to worry about that anymore.
This is supposed to be the intro. It's supposed to be a professional intro. Okay. All right. Stay. There you go. Welcome to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast where we dive into transformative dialogues that illuminate diverse journeys and catalyze meaningful growth. I'm your host, Helen Garcia, and today we're privileged to sit down with the incredible Sam Mark, known for her empowering presence on The Ultimatum, Queer Love. In our conversation, we'll uncover the profound insights Sam gained from her experiences, shedding light on the intricate art of making relationships flourish while navigating emotional wounds. From her courageous journey through emotional abuse to her steadfast commitment to spiritual healing. So grab your favorite chair, just sit back and relax, and welcome to this exclusive interview with Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast.
So I'm wearing my shirt that was actually given to me by one of Aussie's friends, and it says, "Love is all that matters." When I actually had put it on, I have never done this before, but when I saw it in the mirror, I was just immediately drawn to like the contrast of the black and white. And I feel like that actually describes how I'm feeling. There is a lot of, I think, shadow energy or things that I'm working through that have just been coming up. And it's like just been this journey of navigating and like staying with the light, for lack of a better way to put it, and like reminding myself to bring love into the situation. So yeah, it's been a very reflective, emotional last couple of weeks, but I feel like on the other end of it is going to be a lot of clarity. So
what does staying with the light look like for you in those shadow moments?
For me recently, I've actually been experiencing a lot more anger than normal. And I want to say by normal, I mean it actually like really surfacing. I've had a lot of moments of actually feeling into the frustrations with some of the systems and the barriers to a lot of community and like just so many things going on within the world, and also just things that are being called to my attention within my own personal life. It's been acknowledging how angry and frustrated I've been lately, but then also I've done some cleansing. I keep my crystals with me. I use my tarot and oracle cards. And sometimes I've just been, actually this past week, I've been taking more naps than I've ever taken because I've just been so drained of energy.
Really?
Which is just like my processing, like taking a break and allowing myself to just not have any expectations. And yeah, it's been interesting, but it's nice to be able to take breaks once in a while. I tend to err on the side of overworking. So yeah.
I relate to that. I was actually having a conversation with my sister, who is one of my best friends, and she talks about how as immigrants, I feel this need to overwork and to feel overly compulsive. And I sense just from your own spiritual journey and your own awareness about the world that you've done personal work, because you're very aware of that. Like for the first, how long have we been talking? Like 10 minutes that we've been talking?
Yeah.
You're so open about like, oh, this is what I struggle in. And can you speak to this journey? I don't know if it's been a journey for you, but like whether or not you've always been this outspoken or what, how did you get there?
I actually come from a family of very strong women, or I don't know if opinionated and strong are the same thing, but they're definitely more on the independent side, or like the ones who can just like take care of themselves and the people around them. And so I feel like there's been this part of me that had really good role models in terms of being able to speak. But at the same time, I feel like there's always been that part of me that has been afraid to speak certain things, especially those things that are very outside of the norm, that are maybe not considered popular opinion or socially acceptable or whatever the things are. And so that's actually been one of the challenges that I've been working through, is learning how to speak the truths that go against the grain. The truths that encourage, expansion of thinking, that encourage difficult and challenging conversations. And so that is more so the journey I've been on, more so than being able to speak in general. Yeah, it's an interesting thing that I've been working through.
I feel like we just opened a can of worms here, because you talk about how it's easy for you to speak on certain things, but not on others. And I feel like being on a show called The Ultimatum, like finding your love, for example.
Right.
How did you get to that place? Because the show really does talk about, quote, like taboo things like romance, queer issues, understanding like who your mate is, being able to live with someone. Is the relationship going to work? How did you get yourself to a place where you were on a reality TV show and you talked about that? Like, what's the bridge between one to another?
I feel like to some extent, even though I hadn't really started my spiritual journey until after the pandemic had happened, and that's where I actually met Aussie and Charmaine. Charmaine was my friend who was featured on the show. It wasn't until I started meeting a lot of spiritual people, those who were in a same kind of boat of maybe challenging the norm, or kind of those people who always felt like they were out of place within their circles or their families or their friends or whatever it was. And so I started building this sense of community, and going into my spiritual journey. After I had met Aussie, I had these ideas of, we have something that we can bring the world together. And so I just created our brand.
So sweet.
Keep It Saucy. And that was the way for us to share our relationship and how the things came to be, and how it just felt guided by the universe. And so I feel like the show was all part of this master plan that had been started before I even was aware of any of this. And I think the stars just aligned, and we both had this feeling of purpose, and like we were meant to be on it. And we didn't fully know why, other than we had stories to share, and we felt like we were the right people to do that as far as our stories and what we wanted to do with those stories and after. So I'm sure anyone who follows the cast members, we look very different.
Yes, you all do.
We look very different.
That's what makes it great, right? Like to have representation across all spectrums.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I'm just processing a lot of the connections, to be honest. Like even in this past year or two since the show ended, I'm still making connections to things in my past. I started working with a spiritual therapist after the show. And I started making connections to my childhood and recognizing that I knew that I was in a lot of relationships that had repeating types of cycles of things like emotional abuse or neglect or hiding myself. That all led to it. I just didn't quite understand how it all fit in until afterwards. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. There's just, my brain is like...
No, I think that you captured what it was like for you to be with someone that you love and to transform in a way where you felt the need to be better and to pursue purpose. And then you talk about coming out of the show, getting a spiritual therapist. I know you're a fifth generation Japanese American, and you're going through this journey of understanding your childhood and where you've come from. As a therapist, one of the things that I've learned is that we carry trauma in our body. And sometimes that trauma isn't coming from us and what we've been through alone, it comes from our generations.
Absolutely. And so I'm actually fourth generation.
Fourth generation.
Half Japanese, half Chinese. But I do believe that there are a lot of connections, but I don't necessarily think that it's just like my family. I think it's something that is very common to anyone that may have family lines tied to Asia and kind of the dynamics. I think even just as a society, even though we're kind of coming up against so many different challenges with things like legislation and people advocating for their rights and all of that, I feel like there is still maybe more safety in numbers here in the US as far as being able to challenge some of the structures that are maybe outdated or more traditional. I feel like here, it's like you can find so many empowered people who are willing to challenge or speak up or advocate as long as you just look. If you look, you will find them. And so I don't know how that is in other countries compared to here. So, yeah.
I want to go back to what you said where I'm sorry I got it wrong about like the fifth and fourth generation. So mom is Japanese, dad is Chinese. And so what was it like growing up as Sam as a child? What were your parents like?
Yeah, I definitely had a happy childhood. My parents never made us feel like they were struggling. We were not experiencing things like food insecurity and things like that. And so I didn't have to grow up with that. But through working with my spiritual mentor first, and then my spiritual therapist, I started to recognize how much I kind of developed this sense of all of my experiences were minimized compared to everyone else's. And I just developed this interesting way of going about explaining things, almost like it was almost as if I didn't even recognize what that actually was for a child to experience. And I just, was in my bubble thinking, oh, this is just normal. It's always normal. Yeah, I think a lot of it, I'm just like, processing it later in life that I actually did have some chaotic experiences, and I didn't really acknowledge them till this past year, probably.
This past year
or two. Yeah.
Wow.
And even my past partner, where I was in that relationship for 4 years, after I gained the courage to finally come out, just share myself with my close network or family or whoever, it wasn't a safe environment for her. And so I was like put back in this really weird half in, half out of the closet situation. And for 4 years, even just like thinking back on that and how difficult that was and how much of myself I was constantly just suppressing and suppressing and suppressing. And that was my normal. And so, I'm kind of tracing things back to, I had a lot of great memories, but I did suppress a lot and still working on it.
Sam,
to this day.
Tell me about what that was like for you to come out to your family and to be in that half in, half out situation.
I feel like with my family, I was really fortunate that they were so accepting.
Yeah.
And because I was so used to suppressing a side of me and just compartmentalizing everything, I feel like it took me a long time to work towards letting them in. I was very indirect about everything. So it was like just bringing my ex-partner to a family gathering and then almost like letting people come to their own conclusions. And then to my cousin saying, oh, do you want me to let the others know? And I'm like, yeah, sure. I'd rather not have to do it. So I was fortunate with friends and family, but I think my bigger challenges were workplace and professionally.
Wow.
And that fear of not knowing whether I was going to be accepted by them and not being confident enough in myself to just stand my ground of, if you have a problem with this, even though you've known me for X number of years, I haven't changed, then that is not that's nothing to do with me. I didn't have that ability back then. So it was constant fear. There was constant paranoia. I felt like I was just so inauthentic, not just letting people think when they mistakenly say, oh, you're a boyfriend, or do you have a boyfriend, and not necessarily correcting them. A lot of those things, like, they really sat with me, and I felt like a fraud because I felt like I was just lying to so many people all the time. And yeah, I think again, I minimized that experience for a long time.
When you talked about how there were so many things you learned not to say, it sounds like this was one of them, being able to be out and open about who you loved and the partner that you were with. And like, when you talk about this compartmentalizing, how did you get to a place of wholeness? What was the catalyst for you?
I feel like it really has been, my spiritual journey has been a big part of it.
Yeah.
I feel like just meeting Aussie and meeting people who were into spiritual practices, people where I felt like I can just explore my sense of self and identity and not be judged for it or feel judged for it. I think that really just opened me up. It was like, that was actually like my catalyst. It was as if I had been just living unconsciously and not really knowing where I was going. I was just, following my intuition, but not really even knowing what that meant. And so once I started on this spiritual journey, and also that is how I ended up just being very forward about my identity, was because of those suppressing experiences. That's when I just decided, okay, rainbows everywhere. The moment people see anything online related to me, like, they will know,
awesome.
and I don't have to worry about that anymore. All of that was just like gradual points of realization. Like, an experience would happen and I would somehow be able to kind of just like allow myself to reflect and allow myself to have deep conversations with other people who were on these spiritual journeys or these healing journeys and these self-awareness journeys. And so I think if I were to kind of sum that up, it would be finally feeling like I had the safety to explore my own experiences, the safety to explore, what my feelings were in certain situations. And yeah, I don't know if it's an easy, direct answer. I think it's just been a constant learning journey. Just constant.
Yeah, that's the beauty of life, isn't it? The fact that you open yourself up to the universe and the universe is faithful to provide to you when you're that open. There are two things that I feel like I would be remiss in not asking you, because you talk about how meeting Aussie and going through your spiritual journey have unlocked so much authenticity and love and service for you. I want to start with this because I feel like the audience wants to know the tea, right? So like when you met Aussie, for you and your own personal experience, what was it about meeting them that was different and allowed you to walk into your own power?
Yeah. So I've spoken about this a little bit in terms of the way that we met, which was a virtual meetup group that happened because this woman just recognized how many people were isolated when the pandemic happened and started doing virtual happy hours 7 days a week for several months, and just created this space for people to find community. At the time, I first found this group because I was exploring, like, I knew I wanted to be a part of the LGBT community, but because my partner at the time was not out, I felt like I couldn't really do that, like explore or do anything when it was in person, or, have pictures taken of me or find me on even a meetup group. I was afraid that I was going to accidentally out her, and so who knows who might stumble upon it. So it was a lot of protecting, but then again that suppression came in. And so when the pandemic happened, it was almost like this perfect opportunity to be able to do something that was online in this safe space, and no one, unless they were in the community, would know, be able to find me there. And so I signed up for a workshop on lesbian relationships, and it was this this therapist, I believe, or like
That's
somebody
awesome.
who works with like queer relationships. And I was attending this workshop. And so that's how I found out about this group and started becoming a regular. And that's how I met Aussie. And
were
so
you still in a relationship?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So all of this was just like, I wasn't there to meet anybody, and Aussie wasn't there either romantically. But as time would go, there were some days where I was logging into that group probably almost every day. And that's, yeah. And this person held it from Sunday through Saturday. And sometimes we would be on there for like half a day, from like 6 p.m. till like 2 a.m. in the morning, just talking, just groups of us
so
talking.
Beautiful.
Yes.
That's
and
so
we
awesome.
really got to know each other. And it was actually one woman was sharing her story one night about being in a relationship that lasted for, I think, a decade. And she knew that she wasn't meant to be in that relationship, but she stayed it in anyways. And she ended up being in this relationship for a long time that she knew wasn't right for her. And for whatever reason, that sparked a light bulb moment in my mind where I was just like horrified, because I'm like, I've already been experiencing like these challenges or feeling like I'm just giving so much and I'm just drained. I don't want to be 10 years down the road when I knew at this point that this probably isn't the best thing for me right now. And so whatever it was throughout these storytellings and listening to this woman in her 50s talk about that life experience, it's just like hearing these stories just to help me transform the way that I was going about life, and gave me, I guess, the courage to end the relationship. And at that point, I was just, I already noticed Aussie, but it wasn't in like I'm going to,
I'm going to be with you.
Yeah, it wasn't like that at all, but it was almost just like this soul knowing. Same thing with Charmaine. She stood out to me too, and I didn't know why.
Yeah.
And they revealed themselves later of like, we were meant to meet each other for whatever reason. So yeah, that was
back up a little bit. Back up a little bit. So so you had that realization when that 50-year-old woman was sharing that story in the group during like a virtual night.
Yeah.
Was that knowing then followed with an immediate breakup? Or what was that journey of letting go of a relationship that you knew wasn't going to work anymore?
It was pretty soon after. And I felt like it had been building up, and I already at that point, I had been trying to get the courage to recognize that I wasn't happy, that I was feeling just very like heavy, like I had a lot of weight on my shoulders. And yeah, so it really wasn't that long after, because it was almost like I was just seeking these like courageous inspirations. And yeah, it ended up giving me the courage to actually do it. I don't know the actual timeline. Everything kind of feels a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was definitely that story that I heard, because I can go on so many tangents right now, so I'm going to avoid that.
You don't have to not go on tangents, Sam. I would love your tangents. I do want to ask you this, because I feel like this isn't talked about enough, where you were so protective of your partner at the time of like, I don't want to join any of these like LGBTQIA meetups because I know that I would compromise their identity or somehow. And so there was so much suppression for the sake of love and for the sake of service. And I feel like there's so many layers to this question, but I feel like 4 years with someone isn't something that you just decide to leave. And so what was the healing process like for you following this breakup?
I think it's a really interesting, because even before that, I was in a 9+ year relationship. And at that time, I identified as straight. I didn't know what anything else was other than just being straight. And the reason for leaving that relationship was something very similar, different but similar. I actually had a light bulb moment. One day, I was just like, I don't think I'm meant to be in a relationship with a man. Like I just like a cis male. I had that knowing. There was something inside of me.
Wow.
And it's, again, there was a leading up to that point. The culmination point was this like light bulb moment of realization, almost like of pure clarity. And I just had this knowing. I'm like, I'm not meant to be with this male. And it was, 9+ years and very similar pattern where I was like in my, I want to say early 20s at the time, early 20s, mid 20s. And I was like, I don't want to rob this person of finding somebody else and knowing that I have this feeling like I'm not meant to be in this relationship anymore. And again, I was like, I don't want to end up getting committed and get a home together. And then who knows, like, I don't want kids. But at the time I was like, and then what if I have kids? And like, things get messy. And if I have this knowing now, I'm like, I have to be the one to be able to like cut this off. And that's when I was really like, for that whole year, I had been exploring like what my gender was, what my identity was, what my sexuality was. And so it was like, in a way, it wasn't the exact same situation, but it was almost like I'd been there before when that happened. It was like I was already preparing, even though that breakup happened in that moment, I had almost like been preparing for it in a way for a lot longer than that. And so if anything, it was going to be more difficult for my ex than for myself. But it had to happen. I just feel like it's a difficult thing to do. It's a really, really difficult thing to do. But I'm like, just letting it drag on is even worse. And so I kind of had to give myself permission to just like be okay with it and that I wasn't like a bad person because of it. So, yeah.
Sam, I felt an immediate like feeling of relief come over my body when you were telling your story, partly because I think that there's something so beautiful about caring about that person so much that you didn't want to keep them from their person if you had this knowing all along. And I does that come from age? Does that come from being around the right people?
I don't know. I feel like I always like to consider myself kind of like having lived many lifetimes.
Yeah.
I don't know what my past lifetimes might have been, but I feel like I've done this many times. And so I think that there's just like this inner wisdom in me that even before I understood my spirituality and my connection and my gifts that I now share, it was always there. I just didn't know that's what it was at the time. And so I've had those moments where I think I just had that knowing, and I was, for whatever reason, I was able to trust it at the time. And and that's where it's kind of got me.
What was it about Aussie that like kind of attracted you to Aussie?
It's a really interesting feeling to kind of describe of like what that like soul connection feels like.
Yeah.
And even at the time, it was kind of just something like silly of, I really loved watching tarot readings on YouTube and especially the pick a card ones. Like, I loved it. And so we actually would watch those videos together. It would just be on like a Zoom or something and just sharing the screen. And we would listen to them. And like, there were conversations we recognized there were these like really weird synchronicities or like really strange commonalities that we had, but they would be so specific. Like even in places that we've lived, the dogs that our families grew up with, like just the first people we've dated, like, or had been with in a way, like both being twins, like just the weirdest things that are so like not just some blanket common thing. They would be like so specific, and we would like have them in line with each other. And it was just very, it was just like this soul recognition. I don't know how else to
like
describe it.
And it's so different because, you know, when I first met you in Aussie, I think off script only of just reading your biographies, you would think that you're two completely different people. But there's something so aligned, even in your brand. You talked earlier about creating Saucy and how like you both really share this advocacy for spiritual healing and LGBTQIA initiative and being able to talk openly about Asian American queer identity. And like, talk to me about that, like how that relationship continued to blossom in that way.
Yeah, I think it's just we're both very deep people in terms.
I can see that. Even the shirt that you're wearing is like,
no, right?
Love is all that matters.
Yeah, I'm just not one of those people who really enjoys on the surface conversation as much as other people might. Like I've always been a humanitarian. I've always been an advocate. I've just been kind of learning a different side to it. And that is through like DEI work and learning more about like the DEI journey. And so we just would have, in the beginning, we actually butt heads on so many things. We
like
actually have very differing views on certain things. Well, we have 11 years in between us, 11-year age gap, come from different countries, very different upbringings. And so there's just a lot of topics that, you know, we've had our moments of like, I don't think you understand my perspective. So, just very different experiences. But when it comes to our core values, when it comes to the things that we really stand for, like we are so solid in those things. And I feel like that is really what matters. Like the other stuff is like, it can be fluff. It's just, it's a matter of preference. We all are different people. But when it comes to those core values and even just our desire to heal and our desire to do the healing work and kind of dive into deeper territory than either of us has ever experienced in our entire lives, I feel like that is how we've just kind of like, I think that's how we've grown and that's how we've expanded. We've had the opportunity to learn so much more about ourselves through our togetherness. It's it's really interesting.
I always say like it's refreshing when you're with someone that really does their work, you know, and by work I mean being able to go through a lot of healing and understanding where your trauma comes from. And when you're conscious of all of the hurt and trauma that you've been through, you can really share open and honestly with your partner without any sort of shame, or if there is shame, you can be open enough to discuss it. I don't want to skip over this because you did mention, like, I didn't realize that I had repetitive cycles of emotional abuse and a lot of suppression. How did you unlearn it through mental health, spiritual healing? I know that you are an official certified tarot card reader. And so like, I'm curious about like what your journey has been like and just being you.
Yeah, this is another interesting question, and I will do my best to start in a way that is coherent.
Sam, you're being so coherent. You're being so coherent because
Thank you.
You've shared already so much with me, and I just want to pause here and acknowledge that it's not easy to talk to someone about what you've been through. Especially, I consider us like we barely met like twice. And so for you to be able to like share what you've shared with me already about like your own mental health journey, your gender identity, trying to discover who you are, it's a lot to talk about in like an hour. So
yeah,
tangents are welcome.
One of the things that was said when we first met that has just really stuck with me is that I've heard this question asked to me a lot. But then when you asked it, for some reason, again, there was like this click with it.
Really?
Am I tired of, talking about the show or the ultimatum or any of those things? And it has really stuck with me as far as like, I feel like the answer has to be no. It just has to be no, because when I like look on the internet or social media or like any of these platforms, I feel like there are just some voices and experiences that are so missing from the conversations. So I almost feel like I have been waiting for these moments to share these stories. And I feel like I've lived a lot of these experiences so that I can share them. And this is kind of just this opportune time to be able to do that. And we have some level of a platform now to be able to kind of expand it out across wider audiences than we might have, when we first started our Instagram with like 100 followers.
You now have 13.6K last time I checked. So you're doing really good.
Yeah.
I do, before you go on, want to talk about this because I feel like The Ultimatum is one of the few shows that really talk about like queer love, right? And like I grew up watching The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. And one of the podcasts I sometimes listen to out of what's the word? I call it like junk food podcasts. Is that some of the people from the show will come on and talk about how like it's easier to be judged for your actions when people only know that, right? Like when people think about Sam Mark, they think about the show and that's it. But like, I'm really glad that you and Aussie have created a brand and talked about like tarot card readings and spirituality and mental health and done your own form of advocacy work. Because I'm sure like, what are some of the things that people don't know about you that like you want them to see, like the multiplicity of who you are as a human?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people, when they see me, they tend to, if they're going off of the show, that was my journey of learning to stand in my truth or even just have such a strong sense of self that I was able to, advocate for myself, but then again, come from a space of like love. And that has been quite a journey for me to get to that point. And so, I grew up with such low self-esteem, just as a lot of women or people who were even just socially raised as women didn't realize maybe their trans and non-binary identities until later. But I think that's so common to a lot of just kids in general, young adults trying to learn who they are. And that, I feel like because I set such a strong intention before going on to the show that I was going to do my best to stand in my truth and be in that 5D perspective or that, seeing things for what they are perspective. I think it like ended up kind of cutting out some of the journey leading up to that point.
Yeah.
And so even though there was a recognition that I was able to voice things, there wasn't so much of the story behind it. And again, even something that I don't think we'll go too much into for the purposes of this, but growing up in middle school, I don't know if the right word is diagnosed, but I was found to have scoliosis. And that was when I was 12. And I had to wear a back brace, like the old school hard case ones across the whole body for 2 years.
Oh my
during
gosh.
the time when you're
going
like
through puberty.
Yeah.
Oh,
and so going into high school, like I had such low self-esteem that it's been a journey, like learning that self-love piece and that confidence piece. And for me, like if they could have played all of the interviews that I had, so many of them, I was just like, I'm so proud of myself. Like, I did such a good job. I was able to speak my truth. I wouldn't have been able to do this before. Like, I was proud of myself, but I was also giving myself permission to celebrate those moments too, where it was like, no, take a step back. This isn't about me. Like, I know who I am. And as long as I know who I am, then no one else can make me feel or think or believe anything else other than that. And so that was part of that journey. Even the choice to not do my makeup in a lot of the scenes, very self-conscious about like my skin and my face. And I purposely did not wear makeup because that was my way of showing to myself that, you know, I can embrace that part of me. And even though it makes me cringe sometimes, I'm like, I did that for me and I did that for my own journey. But anybody watching would have no idea that that's what I was doing. But that's not theirs to have.
Thank you so much for sharing that was the start of you being real and open and vulnerable with who you are. And I feel like it's been 3 years since the show taping that you were on? 2.5?
2 years, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's been a while.
I want to acknowledge you for being somebody that's really open about knowing that you don't know, you're not done knowing yourself. Because I think that like I've interviewed so many people on the show and there is this like inherent groundedness of this is who I am, right? And it's refreshing to meet someone who is like, you know what, in my 20s, this is where I was as a person. In my, you know, I don't know how old you were, but when you were in that 4-year relationship, like early 30s?
That was mid to late 20s.
Mid to late 20s, and now you're in your 30s. And I feel like giving yourself permission to evolve and change, I don't think is inherent in a lot of people. Does that come from your spiritual journey, or like has that always been inherent in you, Sam?
I definitely think it's always been inherent in me.
Yeah.
And I think it's been more of my journey learning how to express it and express it fully. And like that fear of being judged is always so strong. And I'm still constantly fighting with my ego of like, because like authenticity is talked about so much as like a buzzword, but so few people are actually embracing it for what it really is. And that is, we don't have to always be perfect. And we don't need to always know what we're doing or where we're going. And it's not always about the numbers, and it's not always about the money, and it's not always about, you know, just being celebrated all the time. I think that we've kind of, in a lot of ways, just become so disillusioned by like social media, for example. I do have those moments where I'm like, it's tough to be the one that's not just doing all of the performative stuff that gets, you know, high numbers or high follows or a lot of engagement. And I know that what I bring is not for everyone. And so I do have to kind of like massage that ego every so often and like, it's not about that. It's not.
But to be conscious of that, to be conscious of, is this my ego or is this me serving out of a good place? Like, what's the difference? Like, how do you know that you're serving from ego and whether you're serving to not be performative, for lack of a better word?
My gosh. Yeah, it's definitely, and I talk about this in a lot of my readings too.
Yes.
And not coincidentally, I do read for a lot of Asian Americans.
That's awesome.
So I feel like what I tend to talk about is really building that awareness of our emotions and like when they come up. And so if we can set the intentions to be aware of how we're feeling and actually acknowledge it, because we've just been so taught to push our feelings aside. You know, it doesn't matter, if you have to take care of your parents, like you need to come to work and put in the hours. And, it doesn't matter if your mental health isn't good, like you need to perform or else you're going, right? There's like all of these almost like repercussions.
Messages. Yeah.
Yeah. That we have to just suppress ourselves all the time. And, we have to show that we're doing well by showing our material items in order to show that we're okay. But like, that doesn't tell us anything about our mental health. That doesn't tell us anything about how we're really doing. And that's another separate journey that could be its own conversation of learning like the materialistic side of, I come from the financial industry. And so I was so much just surrounded by toxic productivity, toxic masculinity, like just don't take care of yourself is the way to go. Like,
that's what's trending in the mainstream media now.
Yeah.
That's what's getting approval. Like people who take cold plunges and, no hate to that, but like we can crank up the volume and put it to the extreme. And we think that that's what's going to bring us inherent value.
Yes. Yes. And so it's like, but what do I value? What are my feelings? What if I took away everybody else that's around me and their potential opinions and their judgments? What am I left with? And so that is the question, right? Like, and a lot of us, when we actually dive into that, we're like, we have no clue. We have no idea because we didn't even realize how many demands we were trying to fulfill of everybody and every situation other than ours. And so it's like just setting that intention to be very aware of what feelings come up and actually like acknowledging them when they're there is like, it's everything.
Oh my gosh, that's so true, because I was just talking to a somatic healer today for the podcast. And one of the things that she says is if you can't identify your emotions, you won't be able to acknowledge self, because self is underneath all the trauma. Self is underneath all of this. But the first thing to go automatically when you're going through a lot of unforeseen impact is your ability to feel. And, for a lot of Asian Americans, I can only really speak for myself, really. But for me and my mental health journey, I noticed that feelings had to come out first out of anger. And then after anger, everything else came, sort of like that iceberg. For people listening who might not know self, who are just figuring that out, how do you encourage them to start feeling their emotions?
I always like to encourage people to do, and it's basically right on point with what we're talking about, but do what feels right for them. Yeah. For me, a lot of times it was music, and it still is music. And it's really interesting to look back at some of the songs that spoke to me back then and
what
to realize, and like, so like, India Ari, the artist, was really a huge, like, and I didn't even realize that she was considered like a soul singer at the time and very spiritual. And a lot of Alicia Keys' music I was very into. And so there are just like these specific songs that are like, it's like they speak to me in a certain way. And now that I've become attuned to that, I used to think like, or I used to, as a kid, like mess around and like pretend to be a radio. Like just start singing different types of songs. And like, I just loved music.
My sister and I did that all the time.
Did you?
Yeah. There's home videos of me and my sister pretending to be a rock band, and I would be the drummer.
Funny.
And I would use the shoebox and I would pretend to drum, and my sister would have a fake guitar and she would like start strumming to like Blink 182 and All Star from the Shrek soundtrack.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Music has been huge for me. And I have realized that when these songs, randomly, and I say that with air quotes, come into my mind, I actually take them as cues now to look at the lyrics and to listen to them. And ever since I started doing that, it's like it's interesting what happens.
Can I tell you a weird story?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, by the way, Sam. I was, every time I work out, across the street from me is a 50s cafe. And there was like an inner knowing for me. I was like, I feel like I should go there. And I was journaling about how I wanted to get back into music. Out of all the things that we talked about today, I didn't expect to talk to you about music. And one of the songs that I had learned how to play was, I think it was like Weezer's Island in the Sun. Yeah, it was Weezer's Island in the Sun. And I was like journaling about like, what about music? Like, why does it keep coming up in my mind? And that song, it was a 50s cafe. That song came on. And like, there's something so like crazy about that moment, because my eyes started to go wide of, oh, this is my knowing. Like, this is part of what it is to listen to yourself and to be open to the wonders of what goes on around you. It sounds weird to other people because it's not their experience, but your experience and the specificity around it resonates so much with my own, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I've had some amazing epiphanies. I've had some amazing like breakdowns because the music just like speaks so. And occasionally when music does come up when I'm about to do one of my sessions, I always encourage too, if a specific song comes up, to listen to it more than once, because it's almost like it gets deeper and deeper with every listen. And sometimes it's the lyrics, and sometimes it's that particular vibration of the song, or maybe something behind it when it was created. But I definitely have come to feel more and more like music was absolutely created as like they're just channelings for whomever is meant to need it in that moment, or for whatever it is. I feel like it's definitely something that is like beyond us in this physical, and it goes across generations and everything, and even across boundaries and borders and all of that. So yeah, I think that could be a great starting point of just like allowing and letting go of the thinking mind, and just letting whatever comes up to come up. And then it's in that reflection time afterwards. Yeah, I think just whatever comes to us. We're so used to being told rules all the time. Like, no, meditation doesn't have to be a certain way or look a certain way. Like, healing doesn't have to look a certain way. There is no right or wrong way to do certain things, that we're just like, we're thinking we need like some guru to always tell us how to do it, or else we're doing it wrong. But it's like we have this inner knowing. It's just a matter of whether or not we believe it to be true, or if we are just so used to dismissing it. So
that's so good.
Yeah.
That's so good. I'm actually going through, I don't know, have you heard of this book? The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron.
No, I don't think
it's a book. So it's called The Artist's Way, A Spiritual Path to Higher Creativity. And it's a 12-week recovery program. And I'm on week 4 right now. And one of the things she talks about is, in order to get to a place of synchronicity and knowing, you have to deprive yourself of certain information, because sometimes we go to reading or books or podcasts to tell us how to think, when in reality, we kind of already know what to do. It's just sometimes it's bombarded by all of these confusing messaging. Yeah.
Yes. And that's also why I toggled around with the names that I wanted to use for tarot. And I was like, tarot reader doesn't sound like it fit, because then it feels more performative, like just to make money, like entertainment. And then I was toying with like the advisor, because I'm technically advising people. And I finally decided to go with tarot healer, because when I really honed in on what it was that I enjoyed doing and where I felt I helped people with the most, was the healing aspect. And so when people come to me, I'm like, there's some part of your soul that is looking for something deeper than what you've been doing so far. So a lot of people think that they're coming to ask me about, this partner, or how they're going to find their next relationship, or what to do in their next job. And it's always like, it always comes back to this internal journey. It always comes back to the sense of self and empowerment and like pulling back all those layers into like, what are we really working with here? And so, yeah, that's just, it's just been a path that I've kind of found myself in that I really enjoy, but it's very fulfilling. That I'm not just, trying to fulfill people's requests all the time. I get to honor my own boundaries, even within my readings, and to get to feel like I'm helping to empower somebody to go on their journey of like self-discovery and self-awareness and healing. I feel like that's part of my reciprocation in that energy exchange. And like, yes, empowerment. I'm not just going to hand you a temporary Band-Aid saying like what you want to hear. Like, you're coming to me because you want to really like get to the bottom of what's really happening. So,
and I think that's what creates effective change, when you can see through what someone is saying. And it reminds me of something that my mentor said to me about real true healing. She said that behavior is a symptom of what's going on inside someone's heart. And so when they ask you about, a potential partner or what they're going to do for their next job or what their next step is, it's not really about the next step. It's about, do I trust myself to jump, or can I take the next step? Am I capable, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting, but it is a collective thing to a point, because I am almost saying the same, probably 3 things in different ways for everybody that I read. But it's also because of the nature of, I'm always very like, I don't do fortune telling. Like, please don't ask me to read somebody else's energy. Like, if you're asking a disempowering question, I'm going to help you ask an empowering one.
That's so good. Reframe.
Yes.
Sam, I will say, like, when I looked you up to do some research about you, the number one question that came up is, what does Sam Mark from the Ultimatum do for a living? And like, when you tell people that you're a tarot healer, like, are those some of the questions that people ask you? Like, can you read this person's energy?
So
can you tell me a fortune?
I've learned from there, because I've gone through the actual certification program, and I've surrounded myself with a lot of other ethical readers. And so I've kind of just built all of that into my practice, where I'm very upfront, like, here's my guide, read it. I have a code of ethics. I give you some tips on how to ask empowering questions. And so I get less of that than I did before I knew to set the
precedent. It's always good to over communicate than to under communicate when you're working with someone. I want to be respectful of time. Are you good on time? I've totally lost track of it. I'm so sorry.
I haven't even been looking.
Me either. I was like, because I looked down at the record button, it says 1 hour, 2 minutes. I was like,
I have nothing after this.
Okay, good. Me either. Does finance play a role in the work that you do outside of the number crunching, like with working with people?
1,000%.
It does.
1,000%. And I was in the financial industry for 5 years before I decided to leave. And on the side, it's kind of funny when people ask me what I do, because I'm like, I don't know. What do I do? I do tarot healing. I have an advocacy-based community that I've been building. So that's what my conscious altruism movement is. And I do some virtual assistant stuff on the side. Really, a lot of, I just say like I'm an entrepreneur. I don't know.
Well, you are. You're creating space for community, and you're making money from that community.
Community builder.
Yes, because I want you to speak about conscious altruism, because I feel like the work that you are building in community and with the tarot reading space is allowing an open conversation for people to gather and come together. And I've seen Aussie repost some of your work, and Aussie's really supportive of it. And I love how the two of you kind of collectively support one another. How did you come up with that name? Because it's such a good name, Conscious Altruism.
That's actually where the finance conversation comes in, actually.
Really?
While I was in that industry, it's almost like I experienced the far end of, like we mentioned earlier, like a lot of toxic cultures and behaviors that are very much considered the norm. And it's almost like expected of people to conform to that kind of way of being and existing. And I really there were inklings of it until it became very apparent with like the pandemic happening. And it was a really tough time, even just like mentally and emotionally for anyone in finance, where at least half of our calls were with people who were going through like massive change or like not sure if they were going to lose their jobs and like their businesses were, they didn't know if they were going to be able to stay open. And so the kind of, mental and emotional burden that was placed on anyone in those service industries that were trying to help people through it, like it was a lot. And it was through that experience that I really started recognizing on a very personal level the disparities and where privilege, well, I learned this as I went onto my DEI journey, but it was like that privilege and people in privilege being so like there's just like a concrete wall between them where they can't even see what's like happening to the marginalized communities or low income communities or those who are just experiencing like any type of insecurities. And it just like sparked something within me where I was like, so many people that I would talk to, whether they were from my company or other people in the industry, business owners, anybody that I would have conversations with, I just started to notice a lot of trends. And those trends were a lot of people experiencing more difficulties and more challenges tended to be people who were non-white, tended to be women or people who identified as women, tended to be people in the LGBT community, and also an overwhelming number of people who identified as Asian American as well.
Really?
And so I just noticed a lot of these trends of people struggling and how your traditional kind of what we know now as people of privilege they were like not even aware that some of this stuff was happening almost. And so I just started to see like where money was so, I guess like it was just not in favor of people who don't have money. And so I started thinking about mental health back then because of my own struggles. I started to have conversations with people. I tried to work my way up to certain people like up the ladders and have these conversations. And I just didn't see enough happening. And that's when I took my first diversity, equity, inclusion certification online. And that's when I went on my own journey and I started to recognize all these things. And I was like, oh my goodness, like that is what I've been feeling like being a young Asian professional in finance. Like no one takes me seriously. I will walk into a room and as a woman, as a young person, whatever it is, I'm like, we have to work 10 times harder to be heard in anything. And there were just so many situations where people like, and I was like on it. When I say like I knew my stuff, I knew my stuff. And I still kept running up against so many barriers of like, oh, I rather, talk to this coworker of mine because they must know better than you because they're older. I don't know. Or they would, take the advice of some male advisor or person. And again, I just started to see all these patterns where I'm like, I don't think it's about me fully. I think there are some other things at play here. And the more I started exploring that, I just got more and more evidence of a lot of these things. And that is actually what sparked the conscious altruism movement. I met someone who's now a good friend of mine who is an anti-racism coach. And I was going through their workbook and they had one page where you check box like all of your traits or something like that. And altruism stood out to me. It was like it just stood out. And
Wow.
I was like looking up all the definitions of it and stuff. I was like, this word like it stands out to me. And I don't know why. And when I looked
Mhm.
up the definition, I was like, I love all of this, except for the fact that it almost implies like you're supposed to just give yourself at the expense of like others. Just, and I was like, but that part doesn't sit well with me. So
Yeah.
then I added conscious because I'm like, okay, well, if we do it consciously, then, you know, we can still prioritize our own self
Yes.
and our needs and all of that.
Yes.
And it used to be called the Conscious Altruism Community. And I changed it to movement to add the action, to add the advocacy, to add the engagement aspect to it. And from there, I've kind of just been playing with it and like, you know, just slowly getting it up and going. And yeah, so that's, it actually started because of the financial industry.
That is so, because when you talked about your DEI training and then going into like this anti-racist workbook, like it was a lot of like synchronous moments that informed
Oh yeah.
your community. And if you weren't open and receptive to being able to witness to those moments, this like beautiful like name wouldn't have come into fruition.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I'm a huge believer in the importance of experiencing contrast. Not that everything needs to be challenging, not that we always have to overcome hurdles, but it's like if I hadn't experienced that, I wouldn't know what it's like to be in a healthier relationship with workplace, with work itself, with coworkers, with community, and just even experiencing the, like I said, disparities. I wouldn't have been able to approach it in that same way. Everything kind of just started developing on its own where I'm like, what if I can help bring DEI related concepts to people who would never necessarily like go on a DEI journey like willingly, or it's still not something that, you know, it's a challenging thing to do because you really are called to question a lot of like how you do things or how you like, what are you communicating? What kind of implicit biases do we hold? And where might we actually have privilege where we're not recognizing that privilege? And just, it really puts things into context. It like puts the puzzle pieces together. So I just started indirectly showing people different concepts, but without forcing it on them. Like, you need to be this and you need to be that. It's like, hey, this is what it looks like to put an agenda up front. So anyone with social anxiety isn't feeling anxiety before they go into something that they've never gone to before.
Yeah.
Oh, this is what it looks like to not do X, Y, and Z, or to be, you know, aware of certain accessibility needs and how we might be able to help and contribute and make things more inclusive. And so, just so much has come from it by doing that kind of indirect, not in your face
Yes.
approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sam, I know you have a life outside of this, and so I'm going to let you go. But I wanted to thank you so much for coming on and recording with me, because I learned a couple of things from you just in talking to you for what, an hour, 12 minutes, 50 seconds. But I'll share them with you because I feel like I want to acknowledge some of the space and the beauty that you brought in, where your ability to acknowledge that you don't know everything brought about a sense of relief for me, where it kind of makes me emotional a little bit, because to hear your story, to hear the work that you did for yourself, the honest conversations that you had to have in order to get to this point, to be in a relationship where you are both striving for healing, to be in a career where you know that you're creating lasting change for the community. It does take a lot of humility. And the second thing I learned from you is being able to identify contrast and the beauty of contrast, where I think oftentimes as a society, we see things in black and white, either something was all good or all bad, but to be able to see that sometimes things that were dark can inform light moments. And the last thing too is that like, just be open to seeing and be open to noticing things that might not make sense in the moment, but they will make sense later. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. This was just as positive of an experience for me as well. And I feel like I've been wanting to share a lot of these. So, you created that space for me too.
Yeah. If you're ever open for a part 2, I feel like we can keep talking.
I feel like we can.